Maghanda na ng mahiwagang apple juice at makitambay sa mga yotits dahil walang bawal pag-usapan sa masarap na kwentuhan. Wag Po!
Ay, nililito nyo kami talaga. Sinasadyaan nyo na tayo eh. Oh, Webes ngayon. Webes, isang araw na lang.
Isang araw na lang, weekend na naman.
Isang araw na lang. Ang bilis ng panahon yun, no?
Pero teka po, hindi ko na alam, long weekend ba tayo?
Bakit? Ano na sa Lunes?
May 1.
May 1 ba Lunes?
May 1 ba Lunes?
May 1 ba Lunes?
Tingnan natin.
Tingnan po
Alam mo, itong problema sa news, talagang hindi na minsan kasi,
Kasi wala namang
namang weekend sa
holiday.
atin eh. Oo.
Anong kalendaryo?
Ha? Kalendaryo po, kalendaryo.
Siguro, 30 kasi is
Oh.
Hindi. One is
Sunday.
Monday. Ah, Monday?
Sunday
Hindi, one
po.
is Sunday.
Sunday po, May
Oo.
1.
Minsan, di ba, pag pumapatak ng linggo yan,
Gloria yun.
na-extend hanggang ano?
Gloria yun.
Ay,
Holiday economics.
holiday economics. So, walang ganon. Walang ganon.
Walang ganun.
Walang long weekend. Hindi pa namin alam, pagdating ko sa bakasyon at sa holiday,
Huwag na kayo umasa.
huwag kayong makikinig sa mga giorno kamukha namin. Kasi kami po, parang wala eh, no? Pasko, bagong taon, Holy Week.
Para simple boy, huwag na kayo umasa ng holiday sa Monday. May 1 is Sunday. So, let's leave it at that.
Okay, Bok, dali lang.
Oh,
Pasok na natin
Ayan,
bisita
ayan.
natin. Dahil ano, nakakaya naman.
okay, and we're speaking in Tagalog, so we should be speaking English.
Yes, oo.
So we might run out of English in case we need some help. Jaja, you help us with English, okay?
Yes.
My nose is already bleeding.
Sorry.
Okay. Now, our next guest is coming all the way from the States, right? I'm not sure what Chester, what state
state?
in para so we can para malaman namin kung anong
Time zone.
time zone nila do kung ginising natin ng bisita natin ng madaling araw. Kasi nakaporma pa naman, ganda ng Amerikana. Forma. Philadelphia. Okay,
That's
joining
on the
us
East Coast, diba?
all the way from Philadelphia, USA, is attorney Robert Bob Swift. Okay, he is explain more.
The lead lawyer in several of the human rights cases filed against the Marcoses, specifically in the U.S. If I remember correctly, Attorney Swift, that was in Hawaii, right? In Honolulu, among other places.
Okay.
That's right.
Yes. And let me just introduce you, give a little bit more background, Attorney Swift, Mr. Swift. You had a Filipino partner in this litigation, in this case, who is Attorney Rod Domingo, right? This was one of the earlier successful cases won in an effort to recover monies from the Marcoses. And these monies were supposedly for victims of human rights. In 2011, I think you won the case. There was an award of $2 billion US dollars.
By a Honolulu court.
By I think it's a Honolulu court. Okay, but I think it's only about $10 million. I'm reading that was ever recovered out of the $2 billion, right, Mr. Swift?
No, that's not right. We've recovered about 37 million.
Okay.
Okay.
And all of it from sources other than the Marcoses themselves.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
So you still have a long way to go, Mr. Swift. 32 million out of 2 billion, right?
Well, we do, and the Marcoses haven't made it very easy for us because they refused to give us documents or testify. So we've had to pursue cases in the United States against assets that were allegedly Marcos assets.
But Attorney Swift, maybe we could back up a bit because of course, your audience right now is an audience mostly composed of people who have no recollection, no memory of the cases that were filed then and that were won by your team. Could you run us again through the major cases? If I remember correctly, the $2 billion that was awarded by an Honolulu court, among others. What was that about, and what has happened to the $2 billion since? I understand, because I also understand that at one point the Philippine government was trying to block the recovery of a big chunk of that award.
Recovery on behalf or for victims of human rights, I understand, Mr. Swift, right?
Right. Well, in 1986, I filed a class action suit against Ferdinand Marcos, alleging that he had directed and orchestrated the torture, summary execution, and disappearance of about 10,000 Filipinos during the martial law period. After discovery and 3 phases of trial, a jury awarded a judgment of about $2 billion. We then tried to execute on that, and among other things, asked the Marcoses for documents and testimony with regard to the wealth of Ferdinand Marcos. They refused. I filed a motion for contempt, which the court granted, and ultimately the Marcoses continued to defy the court after being held in contempt. And eventually the court awarded a second judgment against Bong Bong and Imelda in the amount of $354 million. So we've been executing on both judgments, and we've had some success, but only after litigating for years and over opposition of the Philippine government, particularly the PCGG.
I suppose a lot of Filipinos would find it curious why the Philippine government would try to prevent the recovery of that amount. Could you walk us through that? Of course, we're talking about different jurisdictions here, also different claimants, I suppose. What are the variables here?
Well, the position of the PCGG is that all Marcos assets belong to the Philippine government.
Okay.
Because they claim it's all ill-gotten wealth. We claim to the contrary. And so we've been pursuing assets that are in the United States because thus far we haven't been able to successfully have the Philippine courts recognize our U.S. judgments. We're now litigating over a little more than $40 million, which was in a Merrill Lynch account in New York, created in 1972 by Ferdinand Marcos. That litigation we initially won, only to have it reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court, and now we're back in court, still litigating against the Philippine government.
Reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court on account of an opposition or appeal from the Philippine government. Was that the case, Mr. Swift?
Yes. Yes, the Philippine government consistently opposes us in any recovery of assets. But fortunately, we've been successful, largely because we marshal our evidence and we follow the rules of procedure.
Okay. Are you limited in this pursuit of or recovery of monies? Are you limited to assets that are within the United States of America?
Well, until such time as the courts in the Philippines will recognize the U.S. judgments we are. The more interesting thing, I think, for your audience is the judgment that we have against Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Because if he is elected president, he will be very unusual in that he will have a judgment against him for a significant amount of money, which we can try to collect should he, for example, come to the United States.
Tell us about those amounts. This is different from the contempt ruling, right? This is an actual judgment.
No, this is the contempt ruling, it's the contempt judgment. So the judgment is about $360 million at this point, and we have every right to collect that against the assets of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and his mother, Imelda.
Okay, 360 million for contempt, right? Can you refresh our memory, Mr. Swift, what this contempt ruling is all about?
Yes, Imelda and Bong Bong refused to testify as to the Marcos wealth. They defied the court. The court had ordered them to do so and to produce documents. A judgment was entered, the Marcoses appealed and lost. So the judgment is very viable, and it'll continue until at least the year 2031.
So that means, I suppose, that until 2031, neither Bongbong nor Imelda can go to the U.S. without facing arrest. Is that correct?
Well, I can certainly subpoena them if they come to the United States and question them or try to question them. And if they again refuse, I can again ask that they be held in contempt.
Okay.
Okay.
So you have the unusual situation of perhaps a sitting Filipino president, if he comes to the United States, being subject to judicial proceedings in the United States.
That's a curious. That will be a curious circumstance because in the Philippines, the president is immune from suit. I'm wondering what would happen to that immunity. I suppose that does not apply to a U.S. case. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily. Certainly, the U.S. State Department may try to ask a court to grant him sovereign immunity while he's in the United States, but not everything a foreign dignitary does while he's in the United States is necessarily subject to the privilege. For example, if he were to go shopping in New York, that would not be part of his sovereign immunity.
Okay.
Okay, but it is also possible, Mr. Swift, that should he be invited, for example, on a state visit by the United States government, that there would be some legal cover for him or immunity from this contempt ruling.
That's true, but a judge will have to decide that.
Okay, a judge. Okay, so it's not entirely within the prerogative of the, let's say, the United States government or the State Department to grant that immunity.
That's right.
Okay.
Okay.
Sir, let me back up a bit. You mentioned a while ago, I think 36 million up to 40 million in Merrill Lynch put up by then President Marcos in the 1970s. And this amount has already been acquired or what's the word for that? Sequestered? No.
The money, right? The money is in the custody of New York State Court, where we've been litigating over it.
Mm-hmm. But sir, it's been proven, or has it been proven that it really belonged to Ferdinand Marcos Sr. and that he was the one who opened it? I mean, was it under his name or under a pseudonym or an alias?
Right. One of his cronies, Jose Campos, had created a Panamanian corporation for him in 1972. That corporation then opened an account at Merrill Lynch, and $2 million was transferred from Marcos's Swiss account into Merrill Lynch. That $2 million over a number of years grew to $40 million. And it's currently sitting in the custody of a state court in New York, and it'll be released once there's some finality to the litigation.
Mm-hmm. Well, sir, I ask about that because there was a ruling by the Supreme Court in the Philippines in 2003 that forfeits monies that are beyond the legitimate income of the Marcos couple. So I'm asking with interest to that $2 million opened with Merrill Lynch because by itself that's already way beyond the legitimate income of the Marcoses.
The 2003 decision of the Philippine Supreme Court dealt solely with the Swiss bank assets, which then were about $684 million. And that money ultimately was collected by the Philippine government. The Philippine government, a year later, decided to obtain a forfeiture judgment as to the Arelma account, which was in the U.S. so highly unusual for a Philippine court to try to take jurisdiction over money that had already been awarded to the human rights victims. But in any event, the Philippine court, without involving any other parties, decided, oh, we'll forfeit that money to the Philippine government. So the Philippine government is now trying to enforce that forfeiture judgment in the United States, and they've enlisted the cooperation of the U.S. State Department to do so. So that's the nature of the litigation. The Philippine government hanging on to its forfeiture judgment, which we claim is not valid,
Okay.
and us simply trying to execute on our judgment as to the money. Ultimately, hopefully within the next 12 months, there'll be a decision on this.
Okay, so we're talking about money that is being claimed by the Philippine government and on your behalf for the human rights victims. Do we know if there have been any efforts on the part of the Marcos family to withdraw this money, these sums?
There was an effort by the Marcoses in the late 1990s to try to recover the money directly from Merrill Lynch, but that ultimately led to the litigation that we're now in.
Okay.
The Marcoses don't directly claim the money except as beneficiaries of the Marcos estate.
Sir, if you don't mind, how exactly did they try to claim the money? I mean, which member of the Marcos family tried to withdraw the money from Merrill Lynch?
Both Imelda and Bong Bong, and they signed powers of attorney, which then enabled someone to directly approach Merrill Lynch and claim that they were the proper owners of the money.
So in effect,
Merrill Lynch refused their request.
yes, sir. So sir, in effect, the Marcos, I think they're administrators, right? They're
Well, the heirs. I think the son, Junior,
yeah, and
has been
Mrs. Marcos,
designated as the administrator of the estate.
So the administrators of the Marcos estate acknowledge and admit that that money in Merrill Lynch is theirs. I mean, there's no going around that. They're saying that this is our money.
Well, there was a 2012 decision by the Philippine Supreme Court which mentioned that Bong Bong and Imelda had stated that their claim to the Arelma money is limited to whatever they would be entitled to as beneficiaries of the estate of Ferdinand E. Marcos.
Yes, sir. Well, I ask that only because of, again, going back to the 2003 decision. I know the 2003 decision is with regard to the Swiss bank accounts. But because in that decision, the Supreme Court of the Philippines said that the Marcoses could only account for around 16 million pesos in legitimate income for their entire stay in Malacanang. I mean, that's where I'm coming from. That's why I'm asking about the $2 million in Merrill Lynch, and where could it have possibly come from?
Well, the Philippine government, even though it had the cooperation of the Swiss government, has never been able to show that the $2 million was illegally obtained. And of course, it was a long time ago. But most recently, in depositions in the last month or so, I've questioned PCGG officials about that, and they don't know the source of the money.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Well, although in Philippine law, I think it's, among other laws, the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act of 1955, any money of any government official which is beyond his legitimate income, which he can prove, is considered to be ill-gotten and therefore subject to forfeiture.
Well, I understand that's the position of the PCGG, but if they wanted to have a proceeding in the Philippines to adjudicate that, they should have joined all parties who had a claim to it. They never did that. They did it just among themselves and the Marcoses and said, oh, we have this great solution. Here's a judgment. And now they're trying to enforce it in the United States. But there was a lack of due process, particularly because the members of my class, almost 10,000, were never notified and given an opportunity to participate.
Okay. Bok, I
Can
have
we
one more
come,
thing.
Mr. Swift, can we go back to what you mentioned a while ago about the contempt ruling, which is supposed to be in effect until 2031, you mentioned. So can you give us a scenario? What happens if Mr. Marcos Jr.
president.
Visits the United States? Are you planning to get a subpoena from the court? I mean, what happens? What's the legal scenario?
Well, under the rules of court, I'm expected to act in a zealous manner to try to execute on the judgment. And I will do that. I'll do it within the bounds of the law. The only complicating factor is, number one, the Marcoses are not in the U.S., which would enable me to subpoena them. And if they do come to the United States, at least Bong Bong in the future may be subject to diplomatic immunity.
Okay.
Sir, I have one more question, if you don't mind. In all these decades, are there still Marcos monies floating around out there that we don't know of? At least us, that we don't know of. but you may know of. Are there still other assets out there that could or should be subject to collection?
Well, that's the question. And unless the Marcoses testify under oath, then I don't think we will really know the answer to that. What I do know is that shortly after the Marcoses landed in Hawaii in February of 1986, Jaime Marcos left the United States without permission and went to Morocco. She then had several years in which to move Marcos' assets around that she was aware of. That, I think, is one of the missing links in the information about Marcos' assets.
We always hear about 10 billion US dollars, the estimated amount that was supposedly taken. Do we know if we're anywhere near recovering that amount, or if that is indeed an accurate estimate of what the government needs to look for, or what the Philippines needs to look for? Is it higher or lower?
Well, that's anyone's guess. The PCGG states that it has recovered the equivalent of $4 billion from the Marcoses and the Marcos cronies. I don't know what other efforts they have or are likely to succeed on going forward.
Okay. I have one more question. Sir, I asked you about the possibility of other assets floating around. Well, not really floating around.
Out there.
Buried out there somewhere.
Out there.
Because I think it was in 2014 or 2015, there was an international investigation by a consortium of journalists into offshore accounts by political personalities all over the world. And among the names that were floated to have been found to have offshore accounts I think in Panama in particular, was Jaime Marcos. Of course, we don't know the amounts involved and we don't know the nature of the account, but her name came up in that investigation by a global consortium of journalists. Do we know anything about that? Have we heard anything about that?
I heard about it and I inquired about it, but I never received any information from the group of journalists.
Yes, sir. I think they're also looking looking for more data. But I think that's interesting that her name came up, and this was an investigation by journalists from another country, not from the Philippines.
I understand.
Okay.
Okay. Si Panginoon, baka may tanong.
Panginoon.
There.
Okay, we are, by coincidence, Mr. Swift, we have here, I don't know if he was part of those who received a $1,000 check. But he qualifies as a human rights victim. Melvin Calderon, do you have any question? Oh, Melvin, Mike.
Mute ka, mute.
Mute.
You're muted.
Mute, Melvin.
Unmute.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's called Panama Papers.
Panama Papers, yes.
Okay.
By the way, Melvin is one of our co-hosts. He's a photojournalist, a retired photojournalist in the Philippines.
And he was jailed,
jailed and tortured.
in 1972. So, Melvin, do you have a question? Baka gusto mo singilin yung cheque mo.
I think Mr. Swift and I were able to talk during the claimants of 1081.
There.
And Mr. Swift told me that there's no way that I can receive that $1,000 and another $45,000 pesos in amount to pesos, amounting to pesos, 45,000 and $1,000. I did not receive that, but I received the 1 point something for compensation for the $360 recovered.
That's from the Swiss accounts, I think. Diba? Is that right,
Right.
Melvin?
Melvin, I think you're talking about two things. One is the 3 times that I've made distribution to all the people in the class, and the other is about the government, Philippine government's legislation, which distributed more than $200 million to human rights victims, very broadly defined.
Right. I remember that fully well.
Okay, nakakolekta na si paring Melvin, si Panginoon.
Melvin, if I'm successful in recovering the realm of monies, which I hope to be, there will be a 4th distribution to
Ayun.
every member of the class.
I
Ayun.
remember, Mr. Swift,
Malado.
when we won our
40
case,
million.
$2 million. I remember that fully well. It cost about $2 million each for everyone.
Yes.
When we first won, penned by Judge Real in
Manuel
Hawaii
Real.
court.
Right. I don't think it was $2 million per person. I think it was roughly in the area of $200,000 per
Really?
person,
Sobrang
each of the
laki.
10,000.
Puro dollars to
But
Anyway,
200,000
I have
is
donated
10
that
million
already,
pesos.
hoping that we will not receive it anyway.
Well, the thing about judgments is you still have to collect them. And the Marcoses have been very resilient in opposing any collection.
That's really
They've never
true. because
voluntarily given up any money.
That's really true. They have many ways wherein they layered their money deposited abroad. One is Credit Suisse, and the other one is from which bank was that? In Swiss
Banco
Bank?
de Oro.
Swiss banks, eh.
The information about the Swiss banks, of course, is historical. I'd be surprised if they were still using Swiss banks. There are many other ways to hide money around the world, and I'm sure the Marcoses are well aware of that.
Okay. I think we should,
Yeah, okay. Wait, let me squeeze in one last question, Attorney Swift, if I may. One last question. Okay, the $2 billion award by Judge Manuel Real, I'm sorry, just to back up a bit, that can't be collected yet because of, if I got it correctly, because of 2 things. One is it's being contested by the Philippine government as to who the claimant really is, whether it's the Philippine government or the human rights victims. And number 2, of course, you have to have the assets already available and secured for any distribution to take place. Am I getting that right? Is that the situation?
Well, the judgment still exists.
Yes.
The problem is collecting it. And I have to be able to identify assets to execute on in order to do that.
Yes, sir. When you say you have to identify assets in the U.S. Specifically, is that correct? Because of course, if it's not in the U.S.,
Yes.
you may not be able to have jurisdiction over it.
Right. Until such time as the Philippine courts are willing to recognize the U.S. judgments, I'm limited to executing on assets I can locate in the U.S. At the moment, that's limited to the Arelma assets, roughly $40 million.
Merrill Lynch account. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Swift, lawyer for the human rights victims
Thank you, sir.
in the Philippines, who successfully, it was the biggest recovery award, right? $2 billion US. But not the entire amount has not yet been fully, the monies have not been fully recovered yet.
You have to
But
look for
the award remains or stays. Thank you, Mr. Bob Swift.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Kasi dollar
Napalaban tayo
yan
ng
eh. Oh.
Napalaban tayo sa English. Hirap na ako, kanina pa.
Oh, $2 billion
Abogado pa.
is how much in pesos?
Oo.
100 billion pesos. Tama? 2 billion times 50.
But this award was done in 1994. Remember that? Medyo iba pa yung exchange rate. No? Pag dinala mo dito yung pera, malaki na yan.
Hindi. Yung award, hindi naman bago yung amount ng award.
Oo. Hindi, pero I mean, pag kinonvert mo at dinala mo dito, malaki yan. Kumbaga,
malaki yan.
yung parte ni Panginoon, malaki.
Mas masisiyan
Mas
tayo
malaki
doon.
na kayo yung parte ni Panginoon, di ba?
Tapos, yung sinasabi niya na $40 million na nasa Merrill Lynch.
Ayun yung pinag-aawayan.
Oo, yun ang nakahold ngayon. Yun ang hawak na nila ngayon, ng, at least ng court.
Na-identify nila, pero hindi pa nilalabas ng bangko kasi pinagtatalunan pa kung sino ang kung kanino yung pera na yun. Kasi
Kung sinong claimant
kiniklaim ng US government, kiniklaim din nila Attorney Swift for the human rights victims. At the same time, I think there was an attempt in 1990s.
Philippine government, Philippine government. Kiniklaim ng Philippine government, PCGG.
Yeah. At saka ng nila Attorney Swift.
Yeah, and then the human rights victims.
And
So-
Attorney Swift for the human rights victims. And then kiniklaim din, I think there was an attempt to withdraw that money. Sometime, I forgot what date that was, on behalf of the Marcoses.
Sabi niya, mga late 1990s?
Yun
Late
po.
1990s. So, yun. So, yung $40 million na yan, i-translate mo yan sa pesos, mga 2 billion pesos.
Yeah.
Kung times
I
50 lang
remember, Patrick,
Yes.
there's another withdrawal called Operation Big Bird.
Ay, oo.
Kaya Almonte.
Kay Almonte, oo.
Almonte, General Almonte. And another one by Victor Corpus and Associates.
Yun, oo. Masakit, talaga masakit sa ulo po talaga itong I mean, but, I remember interviewing Mr. Bob Swift when this case was ongoing before the award was given by the Honolulu court, Nandito sila, they were visiting Manila with Attorney Rod Domingo, a Filipino lawyer, yung law partner niya dito sa kaso nito, Tatay ni Kogi Domingo, yung artista.
Ayun, isip ko si Robbie Domingo eh. Kogi Domingo pala.
Kogi Domingo, oo. Sumakabilang buhay recently, yung
Oh,
tatay.
yeah.
Hindi si Kogi po, yung tatay. So I remember na matagal na to, it kind of refreshes my memory yung case nito. Pero talagang sa napaka-komplikado, ang daming pera, puro bilyones, may mahirap talagang sundan minsan yung storya.
Parang just to simplify lang, so ang nagtatalo ngayon kung sino yung may karapatan na
Sa pera na yun.
ang kanyang pera. Yung gobyerno ba ng Pilipinas through the PCGG o yung human rights victims as represented by Robert Swift o yung mga Marcoses.
Yun, tatlo nagtatalo sa pera na yun. Yan lang. In the meantime, tumataas ata yung interest. Actually,
gumagana. From 2 million nga, naging 40 million eh.
Yun, oo. Tumataas. So,
2
hindi
million
natin alam
originally sa
kung
sa Merrill
okay lang na nandun yung pera kasi kumikita naman, di ba?
Wag lang mag-value.
Kumikita naman.
Parang yung Swiss bank accounts, from 350 naging 680.
Yes, oo. Originally, 300 million plus,
350, tapos naging 680.
680. By the time na nakuha na ng gobyerno. Hindi, umabot pa ata ng 900 nung naka-escrow yan sa Singapore.
Talaga?
Oo, umabot pa ng 900 million yan nung na-withdraw na.
So, Panginoon, mapapaligaya mo kami.
Balato, Panginoon.
Nalustay na yung pera eh. Unfair na kasi may ibang claimants. Kasi ako point number 8. Point 8 ako. Yung isa, dalawa tama ng bala, ng 45. Isa sa mukha,
May ranking
dibdib.
siya. May ranking siya.
Hindi siya ranking. Ng 0.6 lang siya.
So depende
Sabi
sa
ko,
ratay na
very
nakuha mo. Panginoon, depende sa ratay.
Mas
Sa-
malaki sa kanya compared to what I received. But I was telling him, you deserve more because you had experienced 245 calibers in your body. But he cannot repeat what happened to him.
Yun. Siguro ba,
Magiging sense yan, no?
siguro ba pag isang itlog lang, mas mas mura kaysa dalawang itlog. Parang ganun, Panginoon, ano? Dali lang, mga yotits, mag-gap muna tayo, magbabalik po. Wag po.
Wag Po, ang programang dapat hindi pinapanood. At nandiyan po sa katabi natin, online, si Panginoong Melvin Calderon na siguro pinag-usapan namin kanina kung magkano kaya ang pwede namin kotongin kay Panginoon.
Kulimbat.
Ayun. Papansit ka naman, Panginoon. Ay, hindi lang pansit. Dapat, ano to?
Matagal na yun eh.
Noodle restaurant na yan ng franchise na yan, Bok ng Chowking.
Oo. Yes.
Pero mas maraming iba na kasi very close ako to ang pinakamataas is 0.10. Yung pagpatay ka. Pag 0.9, nasiraan ka ng ulo.
So, saka, Panginoon, doon ka sa 0.9.
Oh, 0.89 lang.
0.8 lang ako. May isang nag-claim, sira daw ulo niya. Nasira ang ulo niya. So, naging 0.8. Naging 0.9.
Saan ka? Panginoon?
0.8.
Oo, malapit-lapit na. Malapit-lapit na doon sa nasiraan ng ulo.
Ang ginawa ko,
That explains it.
pinat and paste ko na ng interview. Hindi ko na rin sinalaysay. Yung isang tao na nabaril ng 45 2 beses, hindi rin niya kaya yung kwento. Wala siyang kwento. Wala siyang salaysay.
So, wala
Kasi
siya nakuha.
importante,
Panginoon, pag ganun, walang nakuha.
Meron siya nakuha kasi confirmed na political detainee siya. 0.6 siya.
Okay.
0.6.
Box,
Mas
tika.
mataas nga ako eh.
Panginoon, para klaro lang, kasi dalawang sets yan eh. Dalawang sets ng perang pinamigay eh. Yung isang set...
Tatlong sets.
Tatlo ba?
Tatlo.
Anyway, tika, isa-isa natin. Yung isang set, ito yung galing sa Swiss bank accounts. Yung pinamahagi ng gobyerno...
Ito yung $1,000.
Yung pinamahagi ng gobyerno through the Enrile Law. the Enrile Law na for human rights victims.
Yun.
Ito yung dinistribute ang portion ng $680 million. Ito, doon meron ka nakuha, di ba? Tama ba?
Wala akong nakuha doon.
Wala ka nakuha doon?
Wala ako doon nakuha.
Okay.
Kasi hindi ako kasama sa nagpadala sila ng notification. How can I receive it? I was in hiding at that time.
Oh, in hiding pa at that time?
Oh, yun.
Okay, sige, sige.
Yeah, I was in hiding. Just like Saturo Campo. Saturo never received it also.
Pero that's one. The other one,
That's one.
kumbaga, number one yun.
45,000 pesos.
Yung number two, itong kay Robert Swift, yung
45,000 pesos.
wala ka rin doon. Hindi
Sumunod.
ka nakalista doon.
Depende na kung ilang points mo.
Yun.
Ano yung pangatlo?
Yung pangatlo, yung kung ilang points ka. Kung
Kung
0.6,
Ilang points
0.5, 0.8. Ang 0.8, mga 1 million something yun.
Oh,
1.8,
di ba 0.8 ka?
1.7.
0.8 ka, di ba, Panginoon? 0.8 ka. So, naka-million
0.8.
ka. Dali na, baka nanonood si Glenda.
Wala,
Yata
ubus na
lang
yan.
yung
Parang
misis yan.
matagal na yan eh. Ubus na yan kasi
Yun.
matagal na yan.
Medyo. Yeah. But the point,
Pre-pandemic yun.
yeah, but I suppose the point is, we're talking about recoveries of money. So, yun. And almost all of it is still pending except for number one. Yung number one, yung 680 million ng Swiss bank accounts. Yung number two, yung sa Hawaii ruling ni Judge Manuel Real, yung $2 billion. Yun lang kasi kailangan pa hanapin yung pera.
Right.
Pero meron ng initial na $40 million, which is around 2 billion pesos.
Nakita na, natumbok na. Yun lang nga, hindi ma-withdraw. Dahil,
Pero ang lit pa lang nun kumpara mo
Nakaipit
sa,
sa kaso.
kumpara mo sa 2 billion na inaward
yes,
sa kanila.
malayo pa hahabulin nila, Panginoon. 2 billion pa.
Mahaba, matagal pa. Saka yung layering lang, galing. Yung fact na, kasi classmate namin sa Cambridge yun, yung isa sa mga involved doon. It's called Panama Papers.
Yeah. Yung Panama Papers. Mga 2014, 2015
Doon
yan.
sumabit ang pangalan ni Jaime Marcos.
Pero wala lang kasing specifics eh. Wala kasing detalye eh. Kung, di ba? Lumitaw lang yung pangalan, walang detalye kung magkano at saka kung ano yung nature ng amounts at ng account.
Yun.
But minimension mo kanina, paano kung mag-land si Bongbong at saka si Imelda Marcos doon sa Amerika? Kasi may outstanding ruling ang Amerika, yung taxation. Hindi nagbabayad ng taxation.
Hindi taxation, Panginoon. Ang binanggit ni Attorney Bob Swift kasi may contempt ruling dahil ayaw mag-testify.
May ruling talaga
na
siya.
mag-ina.
May ruling, unconvicted yung
contempt
dalawa.
ruling lang naman, Panginoon. May ayaw mag-testify doon sa isang kaso. I think para doon sa isang pera ulit na nakaipit, So may contempt ruling na effective until 2031 apparently. So, ang mangyayari, ang senaryo lang ni Attorney Swift, ni Mr. Bob Swift, kung sakali pumunta doon, si Mr. Marcos Jr. Ang mangyayari, he will, bilang abogado, he will have to ask the court to,
Enforce the ruling.
to subpoena and enforce the ruling. But, at the same time, sakaling ang President BBM na yan, sa mga sandaling yon, he also anticipates that it is highly possible na kung imbitahan siya doon, for example, ng US government na bumisita bilang presidente, sabihin natin, Panginoon. Alam natin, hindi ka naniniwala,
Meron siyang immunity.
Hypothetical lang naman to. Pwede naman daw mangyari, bigyan siya ng diplomatic immunity. Parang ganon. Senaryo lang naman, Panginoon, kung ano posibleng mangyari.
At saka, kung sakaling mananalo yung si
Ayun.
the union na yan.
Yan. Oo.
Pero in the meantime, I think kaya siya umabot ng 360 million kasi sa sa interest eh.
Interest, oo.
Pati yung contempt ruling ata may interest yan eh. Habang hindi na nare-resolve dumadagdag. So kung sakaling tapusin niya kung sakaling maging presidente siya, tapusin niya yung 6 years, mas malaki na yung...
Dali lang, itong 360 million for the contempt lang to.
Ayun nga eh.
Ano, laki naman.
Hindi kasi nga, I think...
Makatarungan ba yun? Malaki pa yun sa deposito na hinahabol, sa bank account na hinahabol ata.
Well, I don't know if it's with regard to the to the Merrill Lynch accounts.
Okay.
It could be dun sa $2 billion
Okay. Yung
ruling.
total
Kasi
siguro
yun,
yung hinahanap
yun
nila. Right. Anyway.
And yun nga,
daming
we go
pera.
back to that na na nagpapatong-patong with interest eh.
Daming pera, Panginoon.
Oo, daming pera. Ang daming pera ng mga Marcos. Lumilipad. Hanggang sa kampanya, ginagamit nga nila eh. Patago nga lang.
Pero yun nga kasi, kung assuming na he gets immunity, diplomatic immunity for the next 6 years if he becomes president, that's another 6 years of surcharges and interest.
So, mas magandang bayaran na lang.
Hindi nga.
Paano kung ano?
Alam mo, sabi sa akin ni Kim, ang sabi sa akin ni Kim Inares,
Yes.
sabi ni Kim, kung nung nagka-amnesty kasi.
Dapat binayaran na nila.
Oo, nagka-amnesty yung dun sa estate tax.
Philippine government, BIR.
I think until last
Sa
year.
BIR.
Ang sabi ni Kim Inares, dating commissioner, kung binayaran nila yung kalahati ng principal, quits na.
Sayang, ano?
Quits na. Eh, ba yun nga lang, that amounts to 13 billion.
Nako, aray. Aray. Oo.
Masakit din yun. Pero if they did that last year daw, within yung grace period ng amnesty, wala nang hahabulin sa kanila na 23 billion plus interest.
Yun. Madali naman magpa-amnesty ulit.
Ayun nga. Pero ang sabi rin ni Kim, kung magpapa-amnesty ulit ang Congress, it has to be a general amnesty, not to a specific person.
Yun. Di, mas maraming magiging masaya. Di ba? Ganun lang yan, di ba?
So, yun. Tapos, nag-calculate din si Kim Inares. Mali yung kay Carpio na 203 billion.
Yun.
Na principal plus interest, mali raw yun. Ang computation ni Kim Inares, 205 billion. Dagdag pa.
Oo. Nako.
But anyway, those are their computations. Wala pa tayong official
Dali lang,
word.
maganda tayo ng mga balitang playback. Kasi yung headline natin kanina, hindi natuloy.
Ano nga ba?
Mag-headline muna tayo.
Okay,
Chester?
sige.
Yung headline na napunta sa gitna ng programa. Actually, patapos na. Sige.
Yeah, baby!
Oh, wala.
Wala ba?
Balik tayo sa store natin. Ano yung store natin isa? Si Kevin Espinosa, ang anak ni Albuera Mayor.
Yan po siya, yung may bigote.
Nag-retract ng kanyang testimony laban kay Lali de Lima. Doon sa...
Konting background lang, ano? Ito yung mga early years ng drug war. Isang big-time, supposedly, drug lord na inaresto, no? Saan parte ito, Bok? Sa may Leyte ba to?
Albuera Leyte.
Albuera Leyte, oo.
Anak siya ni... Ano ba yung first name eh? Yung...
Napatay sa kulungan.
Pinatay sa kulungan.
Napatay sa kulungan eh.
oo.
Marcos ang pangalan ng pumatay sa kanya.
Yan. So, siya I think, tumistigo siya laban kay
Laila de Lima.
Laila de Lima.
Doon sa kasong conspiracy to commit drug trafficking.
Oo. Sa loob ng kulungan.
Oo.
Sa loob ng...
Which is an unusual charge, ah.
Bakit?
Hindi ko lang alam. A lot of lawyers are saying there is no such thing as conspiracy to commit drug trafficking. You either commit it or you don't.
Oo nga, no? Drug trafficking na yan. O hindi, di ba? Oo.
Hindi conspiracy to commit
Parang
drug
pinag-uusapan niya mag-drug trafficking tayo.
Oo.
Krimen na yun, parang ganon.
It's not like conspiracy to commit sedition. Iba yun. Nasa revised penal code yun eh.
Yun. Kaya siguro inatras. Kasi ang breaking news po ngayong araw na ito, no? Inatras na niya yung kanyang affidavit laban kay dating senadora. Dati ba? Incumbent pa rin.
incumbent pa rin.
O
Incumbent pa rin.
re-election ni senator na lang na si Laila de Lima. Yan po, inatras po.
Ang di lang natin alam kung gaano ka instrumental tong testimony ni Kerwin dun sa conspiracy to commit drug trafficking case.
Yun, oo. Pero kung magiging malisyoso po tayo, no? Kanina pinag-uusapan lang namin ni Bok, ano? Kasi kakwentuhan namin kahapon si paring Ronald Llamas. Okay, nagkataon, sinabi niya na, alam mo, tuloy mo, Bok.
Well, ano daw? Si Ronald
The
kasi
low-hanging fruit. Tawag niya dito, the low-hanging fruit. Yung prutas na madaling pitasin.
madaling sungkitin.
Madaling pitisin ng susunod na administrasyon.
walang
Kung
update.
sakali mang yung susunod na administrasyon na yan ay ang administrasyon ni BBM.
Si Marcos. So, ang sabi ni Ronald noon, ginas natin nung isang araw eh. Ang sabi ni Ronald noon sa show natin, yung release of Laila de Lima could be seen as one low-hanging fruit.
Madaling
Kung sakaling
pitasin.
manalo si Marcos. Kasi
Ibig sabihin,
wala naman daw banggaan between de Lima and Marcos personally, not like de Lima and Duterte.
so pakawalan lang daw yan within the first 100 days. Baka magbago yung pananaw ng maraming haters at bashers doon sa magiging, kung sakali man po, no, hindi pa naman tapos yung eleksyon, ano, doon sa magiging posibleng PBM administration.
But we're talking scenarios here. We're not
Scenarios,
saying that these are probabilities.
May election pa ho.
These
May
are
election
only
pa ho.
possibilities. Yun lang kasi napakalaking coincidence na nangyari ito eh.
Usapan lang nung isang araw. Ngayon naman po, yan po ang latest development of breaking
Natalas
news.
may alam si Ronald din yan.
Yung lang po, no? Kung magiging malisyoso po tayo, malikot ang isip lang. Pero lahat po ito ay hypothetical lang na it is possible na the release of Senator Laila de Lima
Would change the atmosphere.
would change significantly at least the perception. It would send a signal at least to the international community.
Yeah, kasi
big case to
the community took up
malaking kaso tong
the issue
kay pagkakakulong kay Senator Laila de Lima. It would at least affect or change or improve the standing, at least the reputation ba? Or perception dun sa isang
If not the perception or reputation, at least the atmosphere would
atmosphere, yes.
would be less
The low-hanging
could possibly
fruit.
be less intense.
ang prutas na madaling pitasin. Yan.
So yun.
Mabasa?
Talaga may international man of mystery yung kaibigan mo eh.
Ayun, oo. Hindi lang yun. Matulis pa. I mean, matalas ang isip. Hindi pala matulis. Matalas
Hindi ako nagsabi
mag-isip.
na.
Oo.
Pabati na wak, pabati.
Namali lang ng salita. Yan.
Batiin natin ang masarap para kay Lord. Tantantini. Via 1PH Facebook and YouTube, si Big Evangelista, si Lee Jong-suk. Uy, talagang Koreano siya? O ano? O alias yan? Alias,
Malamang
okay.
Koreano siguro.
Malay mo.
Maraming Koreano dito na marunong mag-Tagalog.
Malay mo pa niya, Leo Jan Santos. O ganun.
Yun.
Diba? Si Len Centeno, Joel Di Magila, Nita Ko, at si Carlo Palomo.
Yes.
Yan,
Diyan po si Panginoon. Tigasan ka. Okay, tigasan si Elmer Apa, taga Capas Tarlac. Si Sherwin Sator Chonco, taga Davao del Norte naman.
Happy birthday! Si Panginoon, yun talaga tayo. Ayun, si Panginoon, ka naman.
Happy birthday!
Panginoon, go.
Sino kayo may birthday?
Basbasan mo ang mga birthday.
Happy birthday! Wala walang mabasa.
Ay, mga tauhan natin
Nabasa?
yan, Panginoon,
Yun.
mga producer
Happy
natin yan.
birthday kay Gabriel Maliani
Si Gab.
from 1PH at YouTube. Lance Damian Advance. Lisa Dulce Gutierrez Enrico. Ang haba nito.
Yan, si Gab
Wala pa
Malyari,
bang-
no, happy birthday. Lance, enjoy
Lisa,
Boracay.
happy
Nagbabakasyon
birthday.
si Lance ngayon. Okay.
Gabi-gabi nakikinig. On behalf of Mr. Manny Magato, via 1PH Facebook and YouTube, Marvic Perez Bordalo, Maylene Ranieses, Mavis, Sam, and Ethan. Mukhang pamilya to Dodong Gato Villena, Ken Rabanes, Rose Kineme, at si Pardy Randillada.
Yes.
Ay, pati ko rin si baka nakikinig si Jan Tongsong. Ayun, nakaskor ako sa kanya ng satellite phone eh.
Wow. Kontrabanda ba, Bob?
Hindi, ano ba? Trabando.
Okay.
Some people feel the need to get an iPhone. I feel the need to always have a sat phone.
Ayun. Sigit ko na rin. Si Jean Gutierrez, pabati lang din ulit. At saka si Ronald Unabia ng Cebu. Happy birthday. Belated. Happy birthday. The Serve. Okay, next. Susunod na basa natin, The Serve. The Serve ba yun? Yan, The Serve. The Serve via 1PH, Facebook, and YouTube. Robert Morsi. Wow.
Morsi.
Robert Morsi. Filipinos deserve full disclosure and total accountability. We could not agree more, Mr. Robert Morsi.
Ito nga si Robert Morsi, ano?
Puro international
Pila
mga
o ano?
natin.
O Amerikano o Pinoy? Okay mo. Meron tayong Korean, meron tayong...
Bisita natin from Philadelphia pa.
Siguro, hindi kaya, no? Hindi kaya. Hakot ni Bob Swift yun.
Malamang nanonood, ano?
Robert Morrissey, taga Philadelphia ka ba? O?
Ayun. Malamang. Okay.
Ano natin dyan? Moe. Exit na. Huwag
Okay.
muna.
Iniiwan po namin sa inyo si Panginoon para bigyan tayo ng basbas. Panginoon?
Magandang gabi po sa kanilang lahat at God bless you. Seryosong dating. God bless you. Amen.
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 Tingnan mo.